rain fell hard on the asphalt, each drop a drumbeat counting down to the moment Ethan Cole had been avoiding for 7 years.
I have to do
His
this.
hand gripped the steering wheel of
No
his
turning back
beat-up
now.
Ford pickup, knuckles white against the worn
Please,
leather.
you have to listen to
Through
me.
the windshield,
What are you talking about?
Marcus Wells's
There's
house
no time. We
blazed
have
with
to leave
light and
now.
laughter. The kind of Friday night gathering that made Ethan's chest tighten with the urge to turn around. 2 hours. That was his limit for any social event. Show up long enough to avoid questions. Leave before things got complicated. He'd perfected the art of appearing present while keeping 1 foot out the door, always calculating the distance to his truck, always maintaining an exit strategy. His phone buzzed against the passenger seat. "Marcus, you better not bail, man. I can see your truck from the window." Ethan's stomach dropped. He'd parked too close. Rookie mistake. Usually he left himself 4 houses of buffer enough distance to disappear without making a scene. But tonight his mind had been elsewhere, circling the same thought that had plagued him for days: Julia would be here. The memory surfaced unbidden 7 years ago, Marcus's graduation party, this same house. Julia home from her first year of law school, confident and exhausted in equal measure. They'd ended up on the back porch talking until 3 in the morning about fear and failure and all the ways ambition could hollow you out. And then Ethan had kissed her. Quick, impulsive, immediately regretted when he saw the surprise flash across her face before Marcus called them inside. They never spoke of it again. Julia went back to Philadelphia. Ethan stayed in Mill Creek, building decks and custom furniture and a carefully controlled life where no one got close enough to leave. The rain intensified, turning the October drizzle into something more committed. Ethan killed the engine and stepped into the downpour, letting the cold shock anchor him in the present. Inside the party would be the same faces, the same conversations, the same careful dance of people performing contentment. And somewhere in that warm, lit space, Julia would be navigating her own performance. Marcus met him at the door with a beer and that easy grin that had gotten them both through high school without too many scars. "Thought you'd bail." "Almost did. Henderson project ran late." "Still building that deck? It's been 3 weeks." Ethan shrugged out of his jacket, already scanning the rooms visible from the entryway. Living room packed with their old crew, David gesturing wildly about something, Katie showing her phone to a cluster of women. No Julia. "Client keeps changing his mind about the railing pattern. Wants it to look like a geometry test." Marcus laughed and steered him toward the kitchen where the core group congregated around the island. The Henderson deck had become something of a running joke among Ethan's friends. But the truth was more complicated. Henderson kept changing specs because Ethan kept presenting better options, talking the man down from Pinterest nightmares that would fight with the roofline and fail inspection. The job was taking longer because Ethan was doing it right, using grade A cedar instead of composite, hand-cutting the custom inlay pattern that would still look perfect in 20 years. He quoted $8,500 for work that Blake Sutton would have charged $15,000 for and delivered half the quality. But Ethan had learned early that wanting more than what you had looked like greed when you came from nothing. Better to underprice, overdeliver, and let the work speak for itself. "Julia's upstairs." Marcus said it casually, grabbing chips from the counter. "Rough week at the firm. Might not come down." The relief hit harder than Ethan wanted to admit. He took a long pull from his beer, letting the cold spread through his chest. Maybe he'd make it the full 2 hours tonight. Maybe he could avoid the tightrope walk of being in the same room with Julia Wells while pretending 7 years of careful distance hadn't been the defining structure of his adult life. The party flowed around him in familiar patterns. Marcus launched into a story about a client who'd tried to file an insurance claim for damage caused by their own poor decisions. David countered with tales of startup culture gone wrong. Katie showed off her engagement ring for the 3rd time, still glowing with the newness of it. Ethan participated just enough to seem engaged, laughed at the right moments, offered opinions that cost him nothing, maintained the performance of belonging without actually letting anyone in. An hour passed. The rain drummed harder against the windows, turning the October night into something that felt more like November. Someone put on music from their high school years. those late 90s alternative songs about angst and alienation that seemed almost quaint now that they were approaching 30 and discovering adult loneliness ran quieter but deeper. Ethan was considering his exit strategy another 45 minutes, and he could claim early morning work when the energy in the room shifted. It was subtle, the kind of change you'd miss if you weren't paying attention to exactly this. But Ethan had spent 7 years paying attention. Julia had come downstairs. He didn't turn around. Didn't need to. He could track her movement through the house by the way conversations adjusted, people shifting to include her in their orbit. Julia had always had that effect, not demanding attention so much as naturally collecting it. Finally, Katie's voice carried from the dining room. "We thought you'd abandoned us for spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are more predictable than you people, and less likely to spill beer on my furniture." The dry humor in Julia's voice hadn't changed, but there was an edge to it now, a weariness that hadn't been there when they were younger. Ethan risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately regretted it. 33 looked good on Julia Wells. She stood in the kitchen doorway wearing jeans and an oversized cardigan that had probably been her father's dark hair pulled back in a messy knot, face bare of the careful makeup she wore in her firm's website photos. The exhaustion showed in the shadows under her eyes, the tight set of her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone braced against the weight of expectations. But when she moved into the room, people still gravitated toward her, not because she was demanding it, but because Julia had always possessed this quality of making you feel seen when she looked at you, like you were the only person in the room who mattered. Their eyes met across the kitchen island, just for a second, a flash. The weight of history and all the things they'd decided not to say passed between them before Ethan looked away, studying his beer label like it contained secrets. "Hey, Noah. Still building things?" She'd made her way to the counter, pouring herself wine from the bottle someone had opened. The question was casual, conversational, the kind of small talk that filled these gatherings. "Still building things. Marcus says you're doing the Henderson deck. That's the contemporary on Maple, right? The one with the terrible feng shui." Despite himself, Ethan smiled. Julia shouldn't know about the Henderson house's feng shui issues. That was the kind of detail you only knew if you'd been asking questions, paying attention to someone's projects, even when you weren't supposed to. "That's the one. You should see what they wanted me to do with the railing. Would have looked like a high school geometry proof." "Did you talk them out of it?" "Talked them into something better. Made a scale model, showed them how the original design would fight with the roof line. They saw reason eventually. After Mr. Henderson tried to explain why his Pinterest board knew better than structural engineering." Ethan laughed, genuine surprise cutting through his careful control. Julia leaned against the counter, and he realized with a start that the rest of the kitchen had drifted back to their own conversations, giving them space that felt both generous and dangerous. "I built the model on my own time. Figured showing was easier than telling." "Smart. You always were better at showing than telling." Something hung beneath the words, a meaning that hovered just out of reach. Before Ethan could decide whether to acknowledge it, Katie called Julia over to settle some debate about a restaurant downtown, and the moment dissolved. Ethan exhaled slowly, realizing he'd been holding his breath. This was the trap he'd spent 7 years avoiding. When they actually talked, really talked without the buffer of other people or predetermined topics, it felt too natural, too easy. Like slipping into well-worn grooves that his mind had mapped and memorized and revisited in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come. The next hour played out in fragments. Ethan stayed on his side of the kitchen, Julia on hers, but his awareness of her location never wavered. When she laughed at something Marcus said, his shoulders tensed. When she disappeared to the bathroom, he tracked the minutes until she returned. It was exhausting and familiar, this constant monitoring, like maintaining a perimeter around a threat that wasn't actually threatening at all. Except it was. Julia had always been the biggest threat to his carefully constructed life, precisely because she made him want to dismantle it. Around 11 people started drifting toward the living room where someone had queued up a movie nobody would actually watch. The party was settling into its late-night phase, quieter conversations, deeper drinks. the kind of atmosphere where truth sometimes slipped past defenses loosened by alcohol and nostalgia. Ethan saw his window. Another 30 minutes and he could leave without it seeming abrupt. He just needed to maintain position, stay visible, let time run out. "You're doing it again." Julia's voice came from directly behind him, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Something subtle and expensive that definitely hadn't come from Mill Creek's one department store. He turned. She'd materialized in the space between the kitchen and dining room, wine glass in hand, regarding him with an expression that was equal parts amused and exasperated. "Doing what?" "Calculating your exit. You get this look like you're measuring the distance to the door. I have an early job tomorrow. Henderson wants to show his friends the progress. It's Friday night. Saturday job." Julia tilted her head slightly, a gesture he remembered from 1,000 shared moments over the years. Family dinners, graduations, that one terrible New Year's Eve party where Marcus got food poisoning and Julia spent half the night making sure he didn't die. "You're not a very good liar, Ethan Cole. You never have been." The use of his full name felt deliberate, almost intimate. Ethan set down his beer, buying himself a few seconds to think. "I'm not lying. I do have a job." "But that's not why you're leaving." She stepped closer and Ethan fought the urge to step back. "You're leaving because you've hit your limit. 2 hours at social gatherings, 3 if you're really pushing it, and then you need an escape route. I've been watching you do this dance for 7 years. Something in Ethan's chest went tight. The accuracy of her observation cut deeper than it should have. He'd thought he was better at hiding it, the constant assessment of exits and escape routes, the careful calibration of how much presence was required before he could disappear. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Julia's voice was soft now, almost gentle, and that was somehow worse than if she'd been confrontational. "It's okay, Ethan. I get it. I'm the same way. That's why I stayed upstairs until I absolutely had to come down." The admission hung between them, unexpected and disarming. Ethan searched her face for the joke, the casual dismissal that would let him treat this as nothing. But he found only honesty. "Then you understand why I need to go." "I understand why you want to, but I'm asking you not to. Not yet." The words landed with more weight than their simplicity suggested. Ethan felt the foundations of his exit strategy crumbling, the careful structure he'd built to protect himself suddenly exposed as the flimsy thing it was. "Why?" "Because I'm tired, Ethan." Something cracked in Julia's voice, a hairline fracture in her control. "I'm so tired of everyone performing at each other. Marcus and his friends in there, they're all playing their roles. Successful small-town professionals, happy with their choices, totally fine with the lives they've built. They're not entirely lying, but they're not entirely truthful either. It's exhausting." Ethan's throat was dry. This was new territory, Julia speaking without the lawyer's careful hedging, without the protective irony she usually wrapped around anything personal. "And you think I'm different?" "I think you're honest about being dishonest. You don't pretend you want to be here. You don't fake enthusiasm or connection. You just show up, participate to the minimum viable degree, and then you leave. There's something almost respectful about it, like you're not willing to insult everyone's intelligence by pretending." That's a pretty generous interpretation of antisocial behavior. Is it antisocial, or is it just honest? Julia leaned against the wall, and Ethan realized they'd somehow moved into the hallway leading to the back porch away from the main party. "I've been thinking about this a lot lately, about the difference between being present and performing presence. My whole career is about the performance. Showing up to meetings, networking events, dinners with clients, smiling like I care about their quarterly projections, acting like corporate law is fulfilling some deep purpose in my life." This was dangerous ground. In all their years of careful distance, Julia had never been this direct, this unguarded. Ethan didn't know what to do with it. "You don't like your job?" It was a stupid question, but it was all he could manage. "I'm very good at my job." "That's not the same as liking it." Julia's eyes were dark in the dim hallway light. I'm excellent at contract negotiation, at finding loopholes, at protecting companies from the consequences of their own negligence. I make a lot of money helping people who already have too much money keep a little more of it, and I come back to Mill Creek every few months and pretend that's enough." Ethan wanted to say something meaningful, something that would match the vulnerability she was offering, but years of self-protection had made him cautious. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the only person here who won't try to fix it." Julia met his eyes, and Ethan saw something there that made his carefully maintained distance feel suddenly cruel. Marcus would immediately start problem-solving. "Have you thought about switching firms? What about teaching? Maybe you just need a vacation. Katie would tell me how lucky I am to have a successful career. But you just listen. You've always been good at that." The observation landed with unexpected weight. Ethan thought about all the times over the years when Julia had been in Mill Creek and they'd ended up in conversations like this, brief, intense moments where the usual social scripts fell away and something more real emerged. Always accidental, never planned, and always ending with Ethan finding a reason to leave before things got too honest, like he was about to do now. "Julia, I really should—" "Don't." She held up her hand, cutting him off. "Don't do the thing where you deflect or make a joke or suddenly remember you need to check on your truck. Just stay for 10 more minutes. Let's go sit on the porch and be two tired people who don't have to pretend for a little while." Every instinct Ethan had was screaming at him to decline to stick to his exit strategy to maintain the boundaries that had kept him safe for 7 years. But something in Julia's expression, a weariness that mirrored his own, a recognition of the exhausting performance they both engaged in, made him nod. 10 minutes. Julia's smile was small but genuine. They slipped out the back door onto the porch where the overhang kept them dry, but the air was thick with moisture and the smell of wet earth. The wicker chairs they'd sat in countless times growing up were exactly where they'd always been. Same faded cushions, same comfortable wear. For a while neither of them spoke. The rain provided cover, a white noise that made the silence feel intentional rather than awkward. Ethan could see the party continuing through the sliding glass door. Marcus gesturing animatedly, Katie and her fiancé slow dancing ironically to whatever song was playing. A tableau of contentment that felt both genuine and performed like most things in adult life. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Julia asked finally, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Really leaving not just Riverside but the whole framework of your life? Starting completely over?" Ethan considered the question. Honest conversation required honest answers, and Julia had earned that much. "Every day, but I never do." "Why not?" "Because I'm good at what I do here. I've built a reputation. People trust me to build their decks and custom furniture to fix the things that other contractors screw up. That's worth something." He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like excuses. "And because leaving would require knowing what I'm leaving for, and I don't have that answer." Julia nodded slowly, like she'd expected exactly that response. "That's the trap, isn't it? The life you have isn't quite right, but it's not quite wrong enough to justify burning it down. So you just persist." "Is that what you're doing?" "Persisting. Professionally, yes. Personally—" She trailed off, looking out at the rain-soaked yard. "I don't know what I'm doing personally. I'm 33 years old, unmarried, living in a city apartment that costs more than most people's mortgages. Working 80-hour weeks for a partnership track I'm not sure I want. I go on dates with men who look perfect on paper and feel like strangers even after months. I come back here and everyone asks when I'm going to settle down, and I smile and say, when the right person comes along, and they nod, like that's a real answer." Ethan's hands tightened on the arms of the wicker chair. This conversation was moving into dangerous territory, the kind of honesty that dismantled carefully maintained boundaries. He should redirect, find some way to lighten the mood, but Julia's openness demanded reciprocity. "For what it's worth, anyone who thinks you need to settle down to have value is an idiot. You're doing exactly what you wanted to do when you left for law school. That counts for something." "Does it?" Julia turned to look at him. and in the dim light from the kitchen window her face was shadowed expression hard to read. Because I'm not sure it's what I want anymore. I think maybe it's what I thought I was supposed to want. Be successful, make money, build a career. Check all the boxes that prove you made it out of the small town and did something with your life. But I'm checking the boxes and I'm still... She stopped, shook her head. Sorry, this is too much. You came here for beer and small talk, not existential crisis hour with Julia Wells. I came here because Marcus would give me grief if I didn't, and because despite every instinct I have telling me to stay home, some part of me apparently needs to subject myself to social situations at regular intervals. Proof of life or something. Julia laughed, the real one, not the polite version she used at parties. The sound made something in Ethan's chest loosen. We're quite a pair. The reluctant socialite and the burnout lawyer. We should start a support group. What would we call it? People who show up but wish they hadn't. Too long. How about the Exit Strategy Club? Ethan smiled despite himself. This was the dangerous part, the ease with which they fell into rhythm when they actually talked. Like muscle memory his brain had never forgotten. I think that's just called being an adult. Julia was quiet for a moment, then shifted in her chair to face him more directly. Can I ask you something? And I want you to answer honestly, not with whatever polite deflection you've prepared. Ethan's pulse kicked up. He nodded anyway. Why do you always leave? The question was simple, but the weight behind it was anything but. Ethan knew Julia wasn't asking about parties or social gatherings. She was asking about the pattern they'd established over 7 years, moments of connection, followed by his inevitable retreat. Conversations that went deep before he found an excuse to extract himself. The careful distance he maintained even when everything in him wanted to close the gap. He could lie, could give her the safe answer about social anxiety or preferring solitude or any of the other explanations that were true but incomplete. But Clara had been honest with him, painfully so, and she deserved the same. Because it's safer. Because staying means risking connection, and connection means vulnerability, and vulnerability means the possibility of losing something I value. So I leave first. Control the exit. Make sure I'm never the one who gets left. The words hung in the damp air between them. Ethan had never articulated it quite so clearly, even to himself. The admission felt like exposing a wound he'd been carefully bandaging for years. And does it work? Julia's voice was soft. All that control, all that distance, does it make you happy? No. But it keeps you from being miserable in ways you don't know how to handle. It wasn't a question. Ethan turned to look at her fully found Julia, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Understanding mixed with something that might have been regret. We're really doing this, aren't we? Having the honest conversation we've been avoiding for 7 years. Apparently. Julia set down her wine glass, wrapping her arms around herself, even though the night wasn't particularly cold. Though I'm not entirely sure what this is. Are we just two people acknowledging that adult life is harder than we expected? Or is there something else we're dancing around? There it was. The question beneath the question, the thing Ethan had been managing not to address since the moment Julia asked him to stay. He could deflect now, should deflect. This was exactly the kind of conversation that led to complications he'd spent years avoiding. But sitting here in the rain-soaked darkness, watching Julia Wells look at him like she could see past every defense he'd ever built, Ethan found he was tired of deflecting. I think we're acknowledging that somewhere along the way, the reason I started leaving had less to do with parties and more to do with one specific person who made staying too difficult. Julia's breath caught just for a second, barely audible over the rain. But Ethan heard it. How long? 7 years, give or take. It wasn't a question, but Ethan nodded anyway. The memory was vivid. Marcus's graduation party, Julia home from her first year of law school. Confident and accomplished and so far out of his league, it hurt to look at her directly. They'd ended up in this exact spot talking about futures and dreams, and all the things that felt possible when you were young enough to believe wanting something was enough. He'd kissed her. Just once, quick and impulsive, and immediately regretted it when he saw the surprise flash across her face. Then Marcus called them inside and the moment shattered. By the time Julia went back to Philadelphia, they'd silently agreed never to mention it. But it had changed things. Changed the way Ethan saw every other relationship, the way he measured every other connection. No one else had ever made him feel the way Julia did, seen understood like his particular brand of complicated made sense to someone. So he'd started leaving. Because staying in Julia's orbit, seeing her a few times a year, and pretending that kiss had meant nothing was worse than the loneliness of keeping his distance. "You never said anything." Julia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Of course not. You're Marcus's sister, my best friend's sister. There are rules. Stupid rules. Necessary rules. Marcus is the most important friendship in my life. I'm not risking that for—" Ethan trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "For what?" Julia's voice had an edge now. "Say it, Ethan. For what?" "For something that probably wouldn't work anyway. For a relationship that would complicate everything. For feelings that don't make sense to act on if you were anyone else. But you're not anyone else. You're Julia Wells and I'm just Ethan Cole, and there's a reason we've spent 7 years not having this conversation." Julia stood abruptly, and Ethan felt his stomach drop. He'd pushed too far, been too honest, broken something that couldn't be fixed. "That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard you say." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the rain. Ethan stood, too defensive instinct kicking in. "What's stupid about it? I'm being realistic." "You're being a coward." Julia's eyes flashed in the dim light. "You're doing exactly what you accused yourself of leaving before things get complicated. Except this time you're leaving emotionally while staying physically present, which might actually be worse." "I'm protecting." "Who, Marcus?" "He's a grown man, Ethan. He can handle his sister having feelings for his best friend. Me? I don't need your protection. I need your honesty. Yourself. Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? Protecting yourself from the possibility that this thing between us might actually be worth the risk." The accusation hit home and Ethan felt anger rising to meet it. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Julia stepped closer and Ethan could see the emotion in her face now. Anger, yes, but something else too. Something that looked like hurt. "You just admitted you've been managing your feelings for 7 years. 7 years, Ethan. Do you know what I've been doing for 7 years? I've been trying to convince myself that you didn't feel the same way. That kiss at Marcus's graduation was just a moment, a mistake, nothing that meant anything. And then I'd come home and see you, and we'd have these perfect conversations, and you'd look at me like I was the only person in the room, and then you'd leave. Every single time. And I'd tell myself I was imagining it, that you were just being you, that I was projecting my own feelings onto someone who clearly wasn't interested." Ethan's world tilted. The rain seemed louder suddenly, or maybe it was just that his pulse was pounding in his ears. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you're not the only one who's been afraid." Julia's voice cracked slightly. "I'm saying that maybe if you'd stayed instead of running 7 years ago, we could have figured this out before we both built entire lives around avoiding it." The words landed like physical blows. Ethan stared at Julia, this woman he'd spent 7 years loving at a careful distance, and felt every defense he'd built crumble under the weight of her honesty. He should say something, should match her vulnerability with his own, should tell her that she'd been the reason he couldn't make any other relationship work, that he'd measured every woman against the impossible standard she'd set, that some part of him had been waiting for her, even while telling himself waiting was pointless. But fear was a powerful thing. Fear of losing Marcus's friendship. Fear of not being enough for someone like Julia. Fear of taking this fragile thing between them and watching it break under the pressure of reality. So instead of speaking, Ethan did what he always did. He looked toward the door, calculated the distance, started planning his exit, and saw Julia's expression shift from vulnerable to resigned. "Right, of course. I should go." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but Ethan couldn't seem to stop himself. "It's late and I have that job in the morning." "Stop." Julia's voice was flat now, empty of the emotion that had filled it moments before. "Just stop, Ethan. You don't have to explain. I understand perfectly." "Julia, go. You're clearly desperate to, so just go. I'll tell Marcus you said goodbye." She turned away from him, wrapping her arms around herself again, and Ethan felt like the worst kind of coward. But he went anyway. He walked through the kitchen without making eye contact, grabbed his jacket from the chair where he'd left it, made some excuse to Marcus about the early job that was becoming more true by the minute, since there was no way he'd sleep tonight. Marcus, already deep in conversation with David, just waved him off without questioning. The front door opened to a wall of rain. The drizzle had become a downpour while he and Julia had been talking, the kind of late October storm that turned streets into rivers. Ethan's truck was 4 houses down, parked far out of habit, always keeping his exit route clear. He stepped off the porch into the rain, letting it soak through his jacket immediately. The cold was shocking, but it felt appropriate. Penance for being exactly who Julia had accused him of being. He was halfway to his truck when he heard her voice cut through the storm. "You're doing it again!" Ethan stopped, rain streaming down his face, and turned. Julia stood in the doorway of the house he'd just fled, backlit by warm light, and laughter, her arms crossed over her chest. But unlike before, there was no understanding in her posture, just determination. Doing what? He knew exactly what, but the question bought him time. Running, just like you always do, just like you did 7 years ago. Julia stepped off the porch into the rain, not bothering to grab a jacket, letting the storm soak her cardigan immediately. "I'm not running, I'm leaving. There's a difference." "Is there?" She walked toward him, rain plastering her hair to her face. "Because from where I'm standing they look pretty similar. Something gets too real, too close to actually mattering, and you find an excuse to go." Ethan's jaw tightened. This wasn't fair. She was pushing him into territory he'd spent years carefully avoiding, demanding honesty he wasn't equipped to give. "This isn't fair." "What's not fair?" "Me calling you out on your patterns." "You're right. That's terribly unfair. Much better to let you leave and spend another 7 years pretending we don't feel what we feel." Julia stopped a few feet away, rain streaming down her face, and Ethan saw something in her expression that made his chest ache. "Do you know what Marcus said to me 3 months ago? We were having dinner and I mentioned hoping you'd finally find someone to share your life with. And Marcus, my wonderfully oblivious brother, who I thought had no idea, looked at me and said, 'Julia, I've known since my graduation party. I've been waiting for Ethan to stop being an idiot and actually do something about it.'" The world seemed to stop. The rain, the cold, the distance to his truck, all of it faded into background noise. "What?" "Marcus knows Ethan. He's known the whole time. And he doesn't care. In fact, he's apparently been incredibly frustrated that 2 people he loves have been dancing around each other for 7 years because of some stupid loyalty to him that he never asked for." Julia's voice was fierce now, cutting through every excuse Ethan had built. "So I'm asking you one more time. Are you going to leave? Are you going to get in your truck and drive away and let another 7 years pass while we both pretend this conversation never happened? Or are you going to stay?" Rain fell between them, cold and relentless. Ethan's truck was right there, door unlocked, escape route clear. He could be gone in 30 seconds, could preserve the careful safety he'd built his life around. But standing in the rain, looking at Julia, soaked and furious and heartbreakingly honest, Ethan realized that safety had cost him everything that mattered. 7 years of keeping his distance, 7 years of protecting himself from hurt by ensuring he never took the risk. 7 years of watching Julia build a life that didn't include him because he'd been too afraid to ask if it could. And what had all that protection gotten him? Late-night conversations with his own loneliness. A reputation as the guy who always left early. The respect of his peers and the isolation of his own making. He was so tired of leaving. "I'm not good at this." The words came out rough, barely audible over the rain. "At staying. At being vulnerable. At trusting that something good won't eventually turn into something that destroys me." "I know." Julia's voice was softer now. "I'm not exactly great at it either. I've spent 7 years building walls of my own, but standing here in the rain, soaking wet and probably catching pneumonia, I'm realizing that maybe the walls were worse than whatever I was protecting myself from. What if it doesn't work? The question came out barely above a whisper. What if we try this and it falls apart and I lose you and Marcus and everything I've built my life around? Then we'll deal with it like adults, like people who care about each other enough to try. Julia reached out her fingers, finding his despite the rain and darkness. But Ethan, what if it does work? What if all this fear and distance and careful management has been keeping us from something that could actually make us happy? Her hand in his felt like an anchor, like a lifeline, like coming home after 7 years of wandering. Ethan stared at this woman he'd spent so long loving at a distance and felt every defense he'd built crumble under the weight of possibility. I don't know how to do this. Neither do I. But I'm willing to figure it out if you are. The rain continued to fall, soaking them both, and Ethan thought about all the exits he'd taken over the years, all the careful retreats, all the moments he'd chosen safety over connection. This could be another one. This could be the story he told himself at 3 a.m. for the next 7 years, the night Julia Wells stood in the rain and offered him everything, and he walked away because he was too afraid to take it. Or it could be something else entirely. Ethan took a step forward, closing the distance between them, his free hand coming up to cup Julia's face. Her skin was cold from the rain, but her eyes were warm, searching his for the answer to a question she'd been asking for 7 years. I'm terrified. Good. Me too. And then Ethan stopped leaving. He kissed her the way he'd wanted to for 7 years, not quick and impulsive like that first time, but slow and deliberate and real. Julia's arms came around his neck, pulling him closer, and she tasted like rain and wine, and everything Ethan had been denying himself in the name of safety. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julia was smiling. The real smile, the one she saved for moments that actually mattered. So, does this mean you're staying? Ethan looked at her. This woman he'd loved at a careful distance, now held close in his arms, and then at his truck waiting behind them, and then back at the house where light and warmth and their friends continued on without them. Yeah, I'm staying. The rain fell harder, but neither of them moved to go inside. They stood there in the storm, foreheads pressed together, learning the shape of this new thing between them, fragile and tentative and worth every risk. Behind them, through the window, Ethan could see Marcus glance outside, see them standing in the rain, and turn back to his conversation with a smile that suggested he'd been expecting this for years. Maybe some exits were worth abandoning. Maybe some risks were worth taking. Maybe staying was braver than leaving had ever been. Julia's fingers tightened in his, and Ethan realized with something close to wonder that for the first time in 7 years, he had no idea what came next. But for once, the uncertainty didn't feel like something to escape. It felt like possibility. They stood in the rain for another minute, maybe 2. Neither quite ready to break the spell of what had just happened. Ethan's heart was still racing, his mind trying to catch up with the reality that he'd actually done it. Stayed instead of running. Kissed Julia Wells in the middle of a storm, and somehow the world hadn't ended. In fact, standing here with her in his arms, rain streaming down both their faces, he felt more alive than he had in years. We should probably go inside. Julia's voice carried a tremor that might have been cold or emotion or both. Before we both end up with hypothermia. Probably. But Ethan's arms tightened around her waist, slightly reluctant to let go of this moment. Once they went back inside, they'd have to face everyone. Have to deal with Marcus's inevitable reaction, with the questions and attention, and all the social navigation that came with making something private suddenly public. Julia seemed to read his hesitation. She poked him lightly in the chest. Be here with me right now. Stop thinking about all the ways this could go wrong instead of just being present. The gentle call-out made him smile despite himself. You can see right through me. I've had 7 years of practice. She kissed him once more, quick and sweet. Come on, let's face the music. They went inside hand in hand, and Marcus immediately called out from the living room. There they are. Were you two recreating your big romantic moment? Because that's incredibly cheesy and I'm here for it. Julia rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. Shut up, Marcus. Never. This is the best entertainment I've had in years. Ethan Cole, former hermit, now standing in the rain, being romantic. Who would have thought? Diane Wells appeared from the kitchen with towels before Ethan could formulate a response. She handed them each one with a knowing smile that suggested Marcus's obliviousness didn't run in the family. You two look like drowned rats. There are dry clothes upstairs if you need them. The casual acceptance in her voice settled something in Ethan's chest. He'd been braced for judgment or questions, not this easy welcome into a family that had always been more home to him than his own childhood house ever was. They toweled off and changed Ethan, borrowing Marcus's clothes, Julia disappearing into her old room. When they reconvened in the hallway 20 minutes later, both wearing oversized sweatpants and t-shirts, the absurdity of the situation hit them simultaneously. This is ridiculous. Julia gestured at their matching borrowed outfits. We look like we're about to have a sleepover. Technically, we kind of are. The reality of that statement hung between them. It was past midnight, the rain showed no signs of letting up, and neither of them was in any condition to drive, which meant they'd be staying at the Wells house. Together. The night after they'd finally admitted 7 years of feelings. Julia must have seen something shift in his expression because she reached for his hand again. One step at a time. We don't have to figure everything out tonight. They rejoined the party, which had thinned to just the core group. Katie took one look at them and let out a delighted squeal that made Ethan wince. I knew it. I absolutely knew it. You owe me $20, Marcus. Marcus pulled out his wallet with exaggerated reluctance. Worth every penny to watch this unfold. Seriously, though. He turned to Ethan, and his expression shifted to something more serious. I'm glad you finally stopped being an idiot. The words were light, but the weight behind them was clear. This mattered to Marcus, not as some source of entertainment, but as genuine happiness for two people he cared about. Thanks for not killing me for dating your sister. The night's still young. But Marcus was grinning as he said it, and the tension Ethan had been carrying for years finally released. They'd crossed the line, and the friendship had survived. More than survived, it felt somehow stronger for the honesty. The rest of the night passed in a blur of gentle teasing and genuine warmth. People filtered out gradually until it was just Ethan, Julia, and Marcus in the living room, the house settling into the peaceful quiet of late night. Marcus stood stretching. I'm heading to bed. You two try to keep it down, yeah? These walls are thin. Julia threw a pillow at him, which he dodged with practiced ease. Once he was gone, Ethan and Julia sat in the comfortable silence of people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. The adrenaline of the evening was wearing off, leaving exhaustion in its wake. But beneath that was something else, a contentment Ethan couldn't remember feeling before. I should probably take the guest room. He said it without conviction, already knowing what Julia's response would be. You could, or you could stay with me and we could just sleep. Actually sleep. I promise to keep my hands to myself. Her voice was teasing but also serious, offering him the choice without pressure. Ethan thought about all the times he'd left, rather than face exactly this kind of intimacy, the slow building of trust, the vulnerability of sharing space without the safety of distance. I'd like that. Staying with you. They climbed the stairs to Julia's childhood bedroom, which still bore traces of the girl she'd been debate team trophies on the shelf, framed photos from high school, a bookshelf stuffed with legal thrillers and classic literature. But the room felt different now, less like a shrine to the past and more like a way station between who she'd been and who she was becoming. They lay down on the narrow twin bed forced close by necessity. Julia curled against his side, her head on his chest, and Ethan felt his breathing settle into a rhythm he hadn't known he was capable of, calm, steady, present. This is nice. Julia's voice was already drowsy. I didn't think it would be this easy. What did you think? That it would be awkward, that we'd spent so long building it up in our heads that the reality couldn't possibly match. But this feels right. Ethan pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with rain. "Get some sleep. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." For the first time in years, he fell asleep without cataloging the nearest exit, without planning his escape or mapping the distance to his truck. He simply closed his eyes, Julia warm against him, and let go. Morning arrived with the smell of coffee and the sound of Diane Wells moving around downstairs. Ethan woke slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar room and the weight of Julia still asleep on his chest. For a moment, panic fluttered the old instinct to extract himself, to put distance between them before things got more complicated. Then Julia stirred, her eyes opening to meet his, and she smiled with such uncomplicated happiness that the panic dissolved. "Morning." "Morning." Ethan's voice was rough with sleep. "Your mom's awake." "She's always awake. Woman runs on 3 hours of sleep and pure determination." They lay there for a few more minutes, neither quite ready to face the world outside this small room. But eventually, practicality won out. They got up, made the bed with the automatic movements of people who'd been taught to clean up after themselves, and headed downstairs. Diane was indeed in the kitchen, surrounded by ingredients for what looked like enough breakfast to feed a small army. She glanced up when they entered, her smile warm but unsurprised. "Good morning. Coffee's fresh. I hope you're hungry. I'm making the full spread." Marcus appeared in sweatpants and a ratty college t-shirt, hair sticking up in 3 directions. "Mom, it's just us. You don't need to cook for 20. "Nonsense. It's not every day my daughter finally gets her act together." Julia groaned, but she was smiling as she poured coffee for herself and Ethan. They settled at the kitchen table while Diane orchestrated breakfast with the efficiency of someone who'd been feeding people her whole life. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan with the kind of scrutiny that would have made him uncomfortable a day ago. Now it just felt like friendship, real friendship, the kind that could survive honesty. "So, you two are really doing this?" "We are." Ethan kept his voice steady, meeting Marcus's eyes. "If that's a problem—" "It's not a problem, man. It's about time." Marcus grabbed a piece of bacon from the plate Diane set down. "I've been watching you orbit each other for 7 years. It was getting painful. All I ask is that you don't make me pick sides if things go sideways." "Fair enough." Diane brought over pancakes, eggs, more bacon than 3 people could reasonably eat. They settled into breakfast with the easy rhythm of people who'd shared countless meals at this table. But underneath the familiar comfort, Ethan could feel the weight of unspoken questions. What came next? How would they navigate Julia living 3 hours away in Philadelphia? What did this mean for their futures? Julia must have sensed his thoughts spiraling because her foot found his under the table, a gentle reminder to stay present. After breakfast, Marcus volunteered to clean up, shooing them away with transparent motives. "Go. Talk. Figure out your life plan or whatever. Just don't be weird about it." They ended up on the back porch again, the scene of last night's revelation, now peaceful in morning light. The rain had stopped, leaving everything washed clean and gleaming. "We should probably talk about logistics." Julia wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, a gesture Ethan was learning meant she was working up to something difficult. "I live in Philadelphia. You're here. I work 80-hour weeks. You have your own business to run. This isn't going to be simple." "No, but nothing worth having is." The words came easier than he'd expected. A day ago, Ethan would have used those exact complications as reasons not to try. Now they just felt like problems to solve rather than excuses to run. "I don't want this to be casual." Julia's voice was firm, the lawyer in her emerging to negotiate terms. "I don't want to keep it quiet or act like it's something we're testing out. And I don't want to do long distance indefinitely without at least talking about what comes next." "What do you want?" "I want to do this right. Take our time, but be intentional about it. I want to meet you in the city sometimes, instead of always making you come here. I want to tell people you're my boyfriend without feeling like I'm going to panic and run." The word boyfriend landed with unexpected warmth in Ethan's chest. He was 30 years old and the term should have felt juvenile, but hearing Julia claim it made something settle into place. "I want that too, all of it." He paused, gathering courage for his next words. I'm going to be terrible at this. I'll forget to text back. I'll probably get anxious about plans and need space sometimes. I have this habit of overthinking everything until it seems impossible. And I'll get absorbed in work and be terrible at making time for us. I'll probably try to solve problems that don't need solving. I have control issues that would make most therapists weep. Julia reached for his hand. But maybe we can be terrible at this together and figure it out as we go. They sat in the morning quiet, working through the practical details that would shape the next few months. Julia would come back to Mill Creek next weekend. The weekend after that, Ethan would drive to Philadelphia. They'd call every night at 9, not when they remembered, but every single night. A standing date, non-negotiable. It felt both overwhelming and manageable. Like any new relationship except weighted with 7 years of history and fear and almost moments that had finally crystallized into something real. I should probably head back soon. Julia checked her phone, making a face at whatever she saw there. I have case files to review before Monday, the joys of corporate law. They said their goodbyes to Diane and Marcus, enduring more teasing and extracting promises to visit again soon. Ethan walked Julia to her car, neither quite ready to separate. 2 weeks feels like a long time. Julia's admission was soft, almost embarrassed. Yeah, it does. We could make it 1 week if you're free next weekend. I'll make myself free. She kissed him, then sweet and lingering before climbing into her car. Ethan stood in the driveway watching until she disappeared around the corner, then stayed there for another minute processing the fact that Julia Wells was his girlfriend and he'd somehow made it through the morning without sabotaging everything. His phone buzzed. Marcus, stop standing in my driveway looking love-struck. It's embarrassing. Ethan glanced at the house to see Marcus watching from the living room window, grinning like an idiot. He flipped him off good-naturedly and headed to his truck. The week that followed established a rhythm that was both thrilling and terrifying. They texted throughout the day, Julia sending photos of terrible office coffee, Ethan sharing progress shots from the Henderson deck. The 9 o'clock phone calls became the anchor point of his evenings. Some nights they talked for hours about everything and nothing. Other nights they were both exhausted and just stayed on the line, the sound of each other breathing enough. Thursday night Julia called at 11 instead of 9. Her voice was tight with stress. Sorry, got stuck in a meeting that went late. You still up? Yeah, rough day. You could say that. He heard the clink of a wine glass, could picture her in her apartment unwinding after another brutal week. We're deep in this pharmaceutical contract dispute. The other side is being deliberately difficult. My senior partner is breathing down my neck and I've been at the office for 14 hours. Ethan sat on his apartment balcony, phone pressed to his ear, wishing he could do more than just listen. Tell me about it. What went wrong? So Julia told him about contract disputes and last-minute negotiations and clients who changed their minds and partners who blamed her for things outside her control. Ethan listened, offering sympathy when appropriate, but mostly just letting her vent. He'd learned over the years that sometimes Julia didn't need solutions. She just needed someone to witness her frustration without trying to fix it. Sorry, she sighed when she finally wound down. You didn't sign up to be my therapist. I signed up to be your boyfriend. Pretty sure listening to you complain about work is part of the job description. Her laugh was tired but genuine. Is it always like this? Your work. The question hung in the air for a moment. Then Julia's voice came back quieter. Pretty much. Some weeks are worse than others, but the baseline is long hours, high stress, constant pressure to bill more close, more deals, bring in more clients. She paused. I'm good at it. That's the problem. If I was bad at it, leaving would be easier. But I'm good and they pay me well and I keep telling myself this is what success looks like. But is it what you want success to look like? The question was out before Ethan could second-guess it. He heard Julia's sharp intake of breath, the way silence stretched between them. I don't know anymore. I used to think so. Used to think that if I just made partner it would feel worthwhile. But now I'm on track for partner, and it just feels like more of the same except with a fancier title and higher stakes. They talked for another 30 minutes before Julia finally admitted she needed to sleep. After they hung up, Ethan sat on his balcony thinking about her words, about being good at something that didn't make you happy, about success that felt hollow. He understood that gap intimately, had been living in it for years. Friday arrived with a mixture of anticipation and nerves. Julia would be here by 6 if traffic cooperated. Ethan cleaned his apartment, actually cleaned it, not just the usual surface tidying, and made sure his workshop was presentable in case she wanted to see it. He changed his shirt 3 times before settling on the first one, feeling ridiculous about being anxious over something as simple as dinner with his girlfriend. His girlfriend. The phrase still felt foreign, but increasingly right. Julia texted at 3, "Leaving office now. Should be there by 6:30 if traffic cooperates." Ethan spent the next 3 hours trying not to check his phone every 5 minutes. He'd planned to take her to a nice restaurant in Mill Creek's historic district, somewhere they could actually talk without running into everyone they knew. But he also had backup plans: simpler dinner if she was too tired, suggestion to order in and just relax. Whatever would make this first real date feel natural rather than forced. At 6:15 his doorbell rang. Ethan opened it to find Julia standing in his hallway, still in her work clothes, but with her blazer draped over her arm and her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she'd been driving with the windows down. "Hi." "Hi." She smiled, nervous and excited, and everything Ethan was feeling. "So this is where you live?" "This is it. Want the tour?" The tour took approximately 90 seconds, given his apartment's size. Living room with minimal furniture, kitchen that looked rarely used, bedroom with a bed and not much else, small balcony that overlooked the parking lot. Julia took it all in with interest. Pausing at the few personal items, he had a photograph of him and Marcus from high school, a piece of furniture he'd built but never sold, book stacked on the coffee table. "It's very you." She turned to face him. "Clean, organized, doesn't give much away. Like you're ready to pack up and leave at any moment." The observation cut deeper than it should have. "Is that intentional, or am I reading too much into your decorating choices?" Ethan considered lying, offering some easier explanation, but they'd promised honesty. "Probably intentional. I've never been good at putting down roots. Feels safer to travel light. Even here in the town you grew up in. Especially here." He leaned against the wall, trying to articulate something he'd never quite put into words. "Mill Creek is where I know everyone and everyone knows me. But that doesn't mean it's home. It's just familiar." Julia nodded slowly, understanding, crossing her face. "I get that. My apartment in the city is the same way. Expensive furniture, nice view, nothing that actually matters to me. Just a place I sleep between working." She moved closer to him. "Maybe we're both a little lost." "Maybe. But at least we're lost together now." "I'll take it." She squeezed his hand. "So what's the plan for tonight? I'm starving and not nearly dressed up enough if we're going somewhere nice." Relief washed through Ethan. "Honestly, I'd love to just order pizza and sit on your balcony and talk. I've spent all week in restaurants and conference rooms. Something simple sounds perfect." They ordered food and settled on the small balcony with beers from Ethan's fridge, watching the sunset over Mill Creek's modest skyline. The conversation flowed easily, touching on Julia's week at work, Ethan's progress on various projects, the surreal feeling of actually being together after so many years of careful distance. "Can I tell you something?" Julia set down her beer, her expression turning serious. "And promise you won't freak out." "I promise nothing, but go ahead. This feels right, being here with you. It feels more right than anything has felt in a long time." She turned to look at him. "I know it's only been a week. I know we're still figuring this out. But I don't have any doubts, Ethan, about us, about trying this, about whether this was the right choice." "Do you?" Ethan thought about the question, testing it against his usual anxiety and need to find exits in every situation. But sitting here with Julia, her hand warm in his, he realized the doubt had quieted. "No, no doubts, which is terrifying in its own way because I'm not used to feeling this certain about anything. We're quite a pair, both terrified of the first thing that's felt right in years." She shifted closer, settling against his side with a contented sigh. They stayed like that until the pizza arrived, then moved inside to eat and continue talking. Julia told him more about her frustrations with work, her growing sense that she'd chosen a career path that looked good on paper but didn't fit who she actually was. Ethan talked about his dreams for the workshop, his fear that wanting more than what he had was somehow ungrateful or foolish. Somewhere around midnight, Julia yawned so wide her jaw cracked. "I should probably let you sleep." Ethan started to stand, but she caught his hand. "Stay, please. We don't have to do anything. I just want to fall asleep next to you." So he stayed. They brushed teeth side by side in his small bathroom, changed into borrowed clothes, and climbed into his bed. Julia curled against him exactly as she had the previous weekend, and Ethan felt his breathing settle into that same calm rhythm. "Thank you for tonight." Her voice was already drowsy. "For not making it complicated. Get some sleep. We've got all day tomorrow." Saturday brought the workshop reveal. Ethan was nervous in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The converted garage was his most private space, the place where he created without judgment or performance. Bringing Julia there felt like exposing something raw and unfinished. But when she stepped inside, her face lit up with genuine delight. "Ethan, this is incredible." The workshop smelled like wood and varnish sawdust coating every surface despite his best efforts to keep it clean. Tools hung organized on the walls, lumber stacked in careful piles according to type and size. In various stages of completion sat the projects that kept him busy: the bookshelf for a client in the historic district, a dining table with intricate inlay work, several smaller pieces he built for himself when he needed to work out a design problem. Julia moved through the space like she was touring a museum, pausing to examine each piece, running her fingers over smooth wood grain, asking questions about process and materials. Ethan found himself explaining more than he'd intended, talking about the satisfaction of fitting joints perfectly, the meditation of sanding, the way different woods responded to different techniques. "This table, the pattern in the center. What is it?" Ethan joined her at the dining table he'd been working on for 3 months. Modernized version of a traditional pattern. The client wanted something contemporary but referenced classical woodwork. So I took this 17th century motif and simplified it, made it cleaner. "It's beautiful." Julia traced the pattern with one finger, careful not to disturb the work. "You should charge more for pieces like this." "I charge enough? Do you—" She looked at him with that lawyer's assessment that missed nothing. "Or do you undervalue your work because you're afraid of seeming pretentious?" The question hit home. Ethan thought about the Henderson quote about all the times he'd priced low and told himself he was being fair when he was really just afraid of wanting too much. Julia must have seen something shift in his expression because she stepped closer. "I'm not criticizing. I'm pointing out that you have the same problem I do. We're both afraid of wanting too much, so we settle for less than we deserve. You underprice your expertise. I stay in a job I hate because I'm scared of losing what I've built." The parallel was so clear Ethan wondered how he'd missed it. "Okay, you might have a point." "I usually do. It's annoying." She smiled to soften the words. "Show me something you built just for yourself, not for a client, not for practice, something you made because you wanted to." Ethan hesitated, then led her to the back corner where a chest sat covered with a tarp. He pulled the covering off to reveal the Hope chest cherry wood, the lid carved with an intricate scene of trees and mountains, the interior lined with cedar. It was the most personal thing he'd ever built, started during a period of insomnia 2 years ago, and worked on sporadically whenever he needed to create something that had no purpose except to exist. Julia was silent for a long moment, just looking. Then she opened the lid, carefully running her hand over the smooth interior. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Why is it hidden back here?" "Because I don't know what to do with it." Ethan felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with Julia, and everything to do with the vulnerability of showing someone something he'd made purely from his own vision. "It's not practical. Nobody commissioned it. It's just something I wanted to make." "You should keep it. Put it in your bedroom. Use it for whatever you want to save, or give it to someone who will appreciate it." Julia closed the lid gently. But don't hide it because you think wanting to create beautiful things is somehow wrong. The words landed with unexpected force. Ethan had spent so long undervaluing his own work, his own desires, that hearing Julia call him on it felt like having a light switched on in a room he'd been navigating in darkness. They spent the rest of the morning in the workshop, Julia asking questions while Ethan demonstrated techniques. She showed genuine interest, not the polite kind people performed at parties, and Ethan found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did when showing his work. Around noon, his phone rang. Thomas Carter's name flashed on the screen. "I need to take this. It's a client." Julia nodded, stepping outside to give him privacy. Ethan answered, stomach already tightening at Carter's serious tone. "Ethan, we need to talk about those 3 projects I mentioned." "Sure. What's up?" "I'm hearing things. Rumors that you're distracted. Relationship drama, maybe not reliable." Carter's voice was careful, like he was trying to be diplomatic. "Blake Sutton mentioned you might be spreading yourself thin, opening a retail shop, personal life taking priority over contract work." Ethan's blood went cold. Sutton. Of course it was Sutton spreading rumors, trying to poach clients by undermining Ethan's reputation. "Tom, that's not accurate. My work speaks for itself. Henderson can vouch for the quality and timeline." "I know your work is good, Ethan. That's why I'm calling instead of just pulling the contracts. But I need to know you're committed, focused. I've got $65,000 worth of projects lined up for you. If you're not in a position to handle them, I'm committed, completely. Whatever Sutton's saying, it's not based on facts." Carter was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate the directness, but I'm going to need to see it. Henderson's deck is a good start, but that Civic Center project I was considering you for, I gave it to Sutton. $40,000. I need to see consistent reliability before I'm comfortable with the larger contracts." The Civic Center. $40,000, exactly the capital Ethan needed for the storefront he'd been dreaming about. Gone to Sutton because of malicious gossip. "I understand." "Good. We'll talk next week. Show me I made the right choice keeping you on these 3. The call ended and Ethan stood in his workshop, fury and fear warring in his chest. Julia appeared in the doorway, reading his expression immediately. What happened? He should deflect. Should tell her it was nothing, just work stuff. But they'd promised honesty, and hiding problems was exactly the pattern that had kept them apart for 7 years. "Blake Sutton's been spreading rumors that I'm distracted, unreliable. My biggest client just pulled a $40,000 project because of it." Julia's expression shifted to the focused intensity he associated with her lawyer mode. "What kind of rumors specifically?" "That I'm opening a shop and won't be able to handle contract work. That personal life is taking priority. Basically painting me as someone who can't manage their commitments." "And Carter believes this. Enough to pull a major project. He's keeping the other 3 for now, but I'm on probation." Julia was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We control the narrative. You invite Carter to see the Henderson deck next week. Show him your professionalism firsthand. I'll come back next weekend. We make sure people see us at church looking stable and committed. Take away Sutton's ammunition." The strategic thinking was so purely Julia that Ethan felt some of the panic ease. They were tackling this as a team, not as separate people with separate problems. "You'd do that. Come back next weekend just to make appearances." "I'm coming back anyway because I want to see you. We just make it visible. Let the community gossip work for us instead of against us." They spent the afternoon strategizing, Julia helping him plan the Carter visit, discussing how to position his business expansion as growth rather than distraction. By the time she had to leave Sunday afternoon, Ethan felt less like he was drowning and more like he had solid ground beneath him. The kiss goodbye lasted longer than it should have, neither wanting to separate. 2 weeks feels impossible right now. Julia's admission was soft against his neck. 1 week. I'll make it work. She climbed into her car and Ethan stood in his parking lot watching until she disappeared, then stayed there for another minute processing everything that had shifted in 48 hours. He had a girlfriend who challenged him to want more. He had a business crisis that required fighting for what he'd built. He had a future that felt both terrifying and possible. His phone buzzed. "Marcus, stop mooning in the parking lot. It's pathetic." Ethan grinned despite himself and headed back inside. The week that followed tested the foundation they'd built. Monday brought another call from Carter confirming the Henderson visit for Friday. Tuesday, Ethan ran into Blake Sutton at the hardware store, an encounter that required Julia talking him down during their 9 o'clock call from doing something stupid. Wednesday night, Julia called at 11 instead of 9, her voice tight with stress she was trying to hide. "Senior partner wants an answer about the pharmaceutical case. Trial in 4 months. If I take it, I'm looking at 90-hour weeks minimum." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What does that mean for us?" "It means I won't be able to come home for 4 months. Maybe 1 weekend a month if I'm lucky. It means no mental space for relationship stuff, just constant work." The old Ethan would have heard this as the beginning of the end, would have started planning his emotional exit, protecting himself from the inevitable. But sitting on his balcony phone pressed to his ear, Ethan made a different choice. "Then we do long distance on hard mode. I drive to Philly when you can't come here. We do 15-minute calls instead of hour-long ones if that's all you have time for. We adjust." Julia's breath caught on the other end of the line. "You'd do that? You don't need to be perfect. You just need to try. Don't disappear the first time you get scared. Talk to me instead of making decisions about what's best for both of us." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. "What if I quit?" The words were so quiet Ethan almost missed them. "What? What if I just quit? I have $150,000 in student loans, a $2,500 a month apartment. But what if I said screw it and came home, opened a solo practice, did contract review and estate planning for local businesses, took a massive pay cut but had a life?" Ethan's heart was racing. "Is that what you want?" "I don't know. Maybe. Probably." Julia's voice cracked. "I'm tired, Ethan. I'm so tired of defending companies I don't believe in, working hours that destroy any chance at happiness, climbing toward a partnership I don't actually want. Coming home sounds terrifying and necessary in equal measure. Then start exploring it. You don't have to decide tonight, but start looking at what it would take." They talked for another hour, Julia working through the logistics and fears while Ethan listened and occasionally offered perspective. By the time they hung up, nothing was decided, but possibilities had been acknowledged, and that felt like progress. Friday brought Carter to the Henderson site. Ethan had the deck nearly complete, the custom inlay pattern gleaming in the afternoon light. Carter walked the perimeter, tested the railings, examined the joinery with the eye of someone who knew quality when he saw it. "Beautiful work, Ethan." Henderson wasn't exaggerating. "Thank you. I take pride in doing things right, even when it takes longer." "I can see that." Carter turned to face him. "Look, I'll be straight with you. Sutton's been in my ear about this retail shop idea. Says you're going to be spread too thin to handle contract work reliably." This was the moment. Ethan could play it safe, reassure Carter he wasn't expanding, delay his dreams to keep the client happy. Or he could be honest and trust that integrity would win out. "I am planning a storefront. Downtown probably next spring. But it's not instead of contract work, it's expanding capacity. I'll be able to hire help, take on larger projects, build inventory during slower periods. If anything, it makes me a better contractor." Carter studied him for a long moment. "I appreciate the honesty. That's worth something." He extended his hand. "The 3 contracts are yours. $65,000 worth of work over the next 4 months. And Ethan, when you open that shop, let me know. I've got friends who'd be interested in custom pieces." Relief flooded Ethan's system as they shook hands. He'd gambled on honesty, and it had paid off. More than that, he'd advocated for his own worth instead of diminishing it, and the world hadn't punished him for it. That night's call with Julia was celebratory. She'd had her own breakthrough, a conversation with a colleague who'd made the jump from big firm to boutique practice and survived. It wasn't a decision yet, but it was research. Movement towards something instead of just away from dissatisfaction. "I'm proud of you," Julia's voice was warm, "for standing up for yourself with Carter, for not backing down on your plans just to make someone else comfortable. I learned from the best. You've been pushing me to see my own value since that first weekend. We're good for each other, challenging each other to want more instead of settling. The next morning, Julia arrived earlier than expected. Ethan opened his door at 8 to find her standing there with coffee and pastries, looking exhausted but determined. I couldn't wait until tonight. Drove up at 6. He pulled her inside and they spent the day doing absolutely nothing productive. No deep conversations about the future, no strategizing or planning. Just existing together, watching bad television, ordering takeout, falling asleep on his couch in the middle of the afternoon. It was perfect. Sunday brought the community test. They went to church, the first time Ethan had attended in months, the first time Julia had gone with anyone other than family. Heads turned when they walked in together. Whispers followed them to their pew. But Mrs. Chen's delighted smile and the Rodriguez's approving nods suggested the gossip was shifting in their favor. After the service, they endured the gauntlet of curious neighbors and well-meaning friends. Yes, they were dating. No, it hadn't been sudden. They'd known each other forever. Yes, Julia was still in Philadelphia. No, they hadn't figured out all the details yet. Through it all, Julia's hand stayed firm in his, a united front against the scrutiny, proof that they were serious about this. That afternoon, as Julia prepared to drive back to the city, Ethan felt the familiar ache of goodbye. But underneath it was something new, confidence, that this wasn't an ending, just a pause. They'd survived their first crisis. They'd shown up for each other. They were building something real. Next weekend, your place. Ethan kissed her forehead. I want to see your world. It's boring lawyer stuff and expensive real estate. You'll hate it. I'll love it because you're there. She smiled against his chest, arms tightening around his waist. We're really doing this. The whole long-distance thing, career changes, facing down small-town gossip. All of it. All of it. Together. Julia pulled back to look at him, her expression serious. I need you to promise me something. If you get scared, and you will get scared, talk to me first. Don't just disappear into your head and start planning exits. Give us a chance to work through it. I promise. Same goes for you. When work gets overwhelming and you start thinking about just giving up on the personal stuff to focus on career, call me. We figure it out together. She kissed him then, deep and thorough, before climbing into her car. Ethan watched until she disappeared around the corner, then stood in his parking lot feeling the weight of commitment settle into his bones. This was real. They were really trying. And for the first time in his life, Ethan believed it might actually work. His phone buzzed. Julia. Miss you already. This is going to be harder than I thought. Ethan. 4 days until Philadelphia. We can do 4 days. Julia. I'm holding you to that. Don't you dare bail on me. Ethan smiled, typing his response. Ethan. No more running. I'm done with that. And standing there in the October sunshine, he meant it. The next 3 months unfolded like learning a new language, stumbling through vocabulary, making mistakes, gradually finding fluency. Ethan drove to Philadelphia on a rainy November weekend and discovered Julia's apartment was exactly as she'd described: expensive furniture that looked catalog-perfect, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view she never had time to appreciate, nothing personal except a single photograph of her and Marcus tucked on a bookshelf. They ordered Chinese food and ate it on her balcony despite the cold, Julia wrapped in a blanket, while Ethan told her about the Civic Center Committee's decision to interview both him and Sutton again. The project wasn't as lost as Carter had suggested. They want to meet in person, Monday, both of us presenting side by side. Ethan's hands tightened on the takeout container. Sutton's going to undercut me on price. That's his whole strategy. Julia's mind was already working through angles that sharp focus he'd come to recognize as her greatest asset and biggest trap. Then you don't compete on price. You compete on value, personal attention, community investment, legacy over resume. Make it about what you bring that a 12-person crew can't. They spent the weekend preparing his presentation, Julia helping him articulate things he'd always known but never put into words. By Sunday evening, Ethan had a portfolio of past work, a timeline with milestones references from satisfied clients. More importantly, he had clarity about what he was offering, not just carpentry, but craftsmanship that would outlast trends and shortcuts. The kiss goodbye in her apartment lobby lasted until the doorman cleared his throat pointedly. Julia laughed against Ethan's mouth, and the sound carried him through the 3-hour drive home. Monday's presentation went better than expected. Sutton arrived with a slick PowerPoint and a bid $5,000 under Ethan's quote. But when the planning director asked why they should choose a one-man operation over an established company, Ethan had his answer ready. Because I'll personally oversee every detail. Sutton's crew does the work while he manages from his office. I'll be on site daily. This is my community. If I build something substandard, I see it every day driving past. Sutton's building a resume. I'm building a legacy. The committee members exchanged glances. The mayor, an older woman who'd watched Ethan grow up, nodded slightly. Wednesday afternoon, Ethan got the call he'd won the Civic Center contract. $38,000 start date in 6 weeks. Julia screamed so loud when he told her that evening he had to hold the phone away from his ear. "You did it, Ethan. You actually beat him." "We did it. That legacy line was all you." "No, that was you finally seeing your own value." Her voice softened. "I'm so proud of you." With the Civic Center money plus Carter's contracts, Ethan had enough capital for the storefront. He called the real estate agent that night and scheduled a lease signing for the following week. The converted space on Market Street, 1,200 square feet of possibility, would officially become Cole Woodworks by December 1st. But Julia's news the next week was less triumphant. She'd given her notice at the firm 4 months to transition her cases properly. Morrison had been coldly professional, making it clear she was burning bridges. Amanda Torres had already started circling Julia's bigger clients like a shark scenting blood. "It's done. I told them I'm leaving." Julia's voice on their nightly call carried equal parts relief and terror. "Morrison said I'm making the biggest mistake of my career, that I'll never earn this kind of money again." "What did you say?" "That maybe money isn't everything." Then I went to the bathroom and had a small panic attack. She laughed, but it sounded hollow. "What if he's right? What if I just destroyed everything I've built?" "Then you build something new, something that doesn't make you hate yourself." The confidence in his voice surprised them both. 3 months ago, Ethan would have echoed her fears, reinforced the safety of staying in a miserable but secure situation. Now he heard himself offering the same courage she'd given him permission to want more, to risk comfort for the possibility of happiness. Julia's transition period proved brutal. She worked 70-hour weeks wrapping up cases, training Amanda on files she'd built from scratch, watching her professional life get parceled out to colleagues who saw opportunity in her departure. The nightly 9 o'clock calls became 10, then 11, sometimes missed entirely when depositions ran late or client emergencies erupted. The distance wore on them both. Some weeks Julia couldn't make it to Mill Creek. Other weekends Ethan drove to Philadelphia only to find her so exhausted she could barely stay awake through dinner. They were trying, but the trying felt increasingly like drowning in obligations neither could escape. Week 12 brought their first real fight. Julia had promised to come home for the weekend, but called Friday at 4 to cancel a major client meeting Monday required weekend prep. Ethan said he understood, but his voice carried an edge Julia caught immediately. "You're angry." "I'm not angry. I'm disappointed." "Those aren't mutually exclusive." Julia's lawyer training made her precise even in conflict. "Say what you're actually feeling." "Fine. I'm frustrated. You promised you'd be here and now you're not, and it feels like work always wins, like I'm always the thing that gets postponed when something more important comes up. That's not fair. This is a transition period. You knew it would be hard. Hard is one thing, feeling like an afterthought is something else." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Then Julia's voice came back tight with her own frustration. "I'm doing the best I can. I'm working myself to death to leave this job properly, giving up a career I spent 7 years building, taking a huge financial risk to be closer to you. And you're mad that I can't drop everything the second you want me there?" That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? Because it sounds like you want me to sacrifice my professional integrity to prove I care about us. Ethan paced his apartment phone pressed hard against his ear, searching for words that wouldn't make this worse. I just want to feel like I matter as much as your cases do. Julia's sharp intake of breath told him he'd hit a nerve. You know what, I'm too tired for this. I've been up since 5. I'll be working until midnight, and I don't have the energy to convince you that you're important to me when I'm literally rearranging my entire life to be with you. Julia, I'll call you tomorrow when we've both calmed down. The line went dead. Ethan stared at his phone, stomach churning with the realization that he'd just repeated exactly the pattern he'd promised to break, pushing away when things got hard, creating distance instead of working through discomfort. He called back immediately. Julia answered on the first ring, and he could hear tears in her voice. I'm sorry. That was unfair and I was an ass about it. You were. But I'm sorry too. You're right that work takes priority too often. I'm just scared that if I don't do this transition perfectly, I'll regret leaving, or resent you for being the reason I left. I don't want to be your reason for leaving. I want you to leave because you want a different life, because staying makes you miserable. I know, Julia's voice cracked. I'm terrified of giving up security, of disappointing everyone who believed in me, of discovering I made the wrong choice. And when you push back on the work stuff, it feels like one more person questioning my decisions. They talked for another hour, working through the fear and frustration until they found solid ground again. By the end, nothing was resolved, but everything felt less catastrophic. They agreed Julia would come home the following weekend, no matter what, that Ethan would be more patient with her timeline, that they'd both try harder to communicate before resentment built. After they hung up, Ethan sat in the dark of his apartment thinking about how much easier it would have been to just shut down, put up walls, protect himself from the vulnerability of real conflict. But he'd promised Julia he'd stay, and staying meant fighting through hard conversations instead of running from them. December brought Julia's transition into its final phase. She'd be done at the firm by Christmas, start at Hayes Manufacturing in January. Martin Hayes had offered her $95,000 annually for in-house counsel work, 45-hour weeks benefits, working from Mill Creek's small manufacturing office. It was less money, but more life, and Julia had accepted with a relief that told Ethan she'd made the right choice. But first, she had to survive the last 3 weeks. Morrison was extracting every ounce of work he could, Amanda was undermining her with clients, and the firm's holiday party became an exercise in fake smiles and passive-aggressive comments about her surprising decision to leave. Julia showed up at Ethan's apartment the Friday before the storefront opening, looking hollowed out. I can't do this anymore. I can't smile through one more conversation about how I'm wasting my potential or settling for less. Morrison actually said that, settling for less. Like marrying myself to an 80-hour work week, defending corporations is aspirational, and having a life is failure. Ethan pulled her close, feeling the tension vibrating through her shoulders. 3 more weeks. Then you're done. 3 weeks feels impossible. Julia's voice was muffled against his chest. But I'm here now. Show me your shop. Distract me from my terrible life choices. Cole Woodworks occupied the corner of Market and 3rd Windows, facing both streets, exposed brick interior that Ethan had spent weeks restoring. Julia walked through the space with growing delight, examining the finished pieces on display tables and chairs, and the hope chest, which now held pride of place near the front window. You brought it out of hiding. Someone wise told me not to hide things just because they matter. Ethan watched her trace the carved lid. It's the centerpiece. Helps people understand what I can do. The workshop area in back was smaller than his garage space, but more professional. Better lighting, proper ventilation, enough room to work on custom projects while maintaining the retail front. Julia helped him arrange furniture and price tags, offering opinions on placement that improved his initial layout. You need a story, not just handcrafted furniture, but why you do this. What makes your work different? She was right. They spent Saturday crafting language for the signs and website, emphasis on local materials, Traditional techniques, pieces built to last generations. Not mass production, but careful creation. Legacy work. The opening was Sunday, a soft launch before the official grand opening next weekend. Marcus showed up with Diane, both carrying baked goods and coffee. A few neighbors wandered in, curious about the new business. Tom Carter stopped by with 2 colleagues from his development company, all 3 expressing interest in custom pieces for upcoming projects. By mid-afternoon, Ethan had sold $8,500 worth of furniture, 3 major pieces, and several smaller items. More importantly, he'd collected contact information from a dozen potential custom clients. Julia stayed through it all, talking to customers with the professional warmth she used in client meetings, but somehow making it genuine. When the last visitor left, she turned to Ethan with undisguised pride. "You did it. Actually built something that's yours." "We did it. You pushed me to see this was possible." "No, this is all you. I just reminded you what you already knew." Marcus cleared his throat from where he'd been cleaning up coffee cups. "Okay. You 2 are getting gross with the mutual admiration. Julia, Mom wants you home for dinner. Ethan, you're invited too, since apparently you're family now." The casual acceptance in his voice settled something in Ethan's chest. They'd crossed from childhood friends to something deeper, chosen family, the kind built on honesty instead of just history. Dinner at the Wells house was chaotic in the best way. Diane had invited half the neighborhood to celebrate the shop opening, turning it into an impromptu party. Mrs. Chen cornered Ethan to talk about her son Daniel, who was returning to Mill Creek in January to open an architecture firm and would need custom woodwork for his office renovation. "You 2 should connect. He's looking for quality craftsmen who understand historical building requirements." Ethan took her number, making mental notes. More connections, more possibilities. The town he'd kept at arm's length for years was suddenly revealing itself as a network of opportunity he'd been too closed off to see. Julia found him on the back porch, later escaping the noise for a moment of quiet. "You okay? That's a lot of people." "Yeah, just needed air." He pulled her close. "Thank you. For today, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." "You could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." They stood in the December cold, watching their breath fog in the air, and Ethan thought about how much had changed in 3 months. He had a business he was proud of, a relationship that felt real despite the challenges, a future that looked less like just surviving and more like actually building something meaningful. "I need to tell you something." Julia's voice had that careful quality that meant she'd been working up to this. "Hayes wants me to start earlier, January 2nd instead of mid-January. It means I can break my apartment lease at the end of December, move home for good." Ethan's heart kicked up. "That's great. Isn't it?" "It is, I think. It's also terrifying. I'm giving up my apartment, my salary, the career I've built. Coming back to Mill Creek permanently. And I keep wondering if I'm making a huge mistake." "Are you having second thoughts?" "About the job number, about us number." Julia turned to face him. "But I'm scared I'm putting too much pressure on this relationship by tying it to such a big life change. What if we don't work out and I've burned all my bridges for nothing?" The fear was reasonable. They'd been together 3 months, most of it long distance. Moving back to Mill Creek was a massive commitment, and if things fell apart, Julia would be stuck in a small town with her ex-boyfriend and professional consequences she couldn't undo. But Ethan had learned something in the past 3 months about courage and commitment. You couldn't wait for certainty before taking risks. You had to trust the foundation you'd built and leap anyway. "Move in with me." The words were out before he'd fully thought them through, but they felt right. Julia stared at him. "What?" "Don't get your own place. Move in with me. It's fast and probably crazy, but we've known each other our whole lives. We've been dancing around this for 7 years, and I don't want to waste more time being careful when I already know I want you here." "Ethan, we've only been officially together 3 months." "I know, but I also know I'm done running. I'm done protecting myself from the possibility that this might not work. I'd rather try and fail than spend another 7 years wondering what if." Julia's eyes were bright with tears that could have been fear or joy or both. You're serious? Completely. Move in with me. Let's figure out what comes next together instead of separately. She kissed him, then hard and desperate, and Ethan tasted salt from tears he couldn't tell were hers or his. Okay, yes, this is probably insane, but yes. They went back inside to tell Marcus and Diane, whose reactions ranged from delighted to unsurprised. Diane immediately started planning how they'd move Julia's things. Marcus made jokes about finally getting his best friend and sister to stop being idiots, and Ethan felt the weight of commitment settle into something that felt less like burden and more like foundation. The last 3 weeks of December blurred together. Julia finished at the firm with a coldness from Morrison that bordered on hostile and a vindictive performance review from Amanda that Julia crumpled and threw away without reading. She packed up her Philadelphia apartment with ruthless efficiency, keeping only what mattered and selling or donating the expensive furniture that had never felt like hers anyway. Ethan drove to the city on her final day, helped her load boxes into a U-Haul, and stood in her empty apartment while she took one last look around. Any regrets? Julia was quiet for a moment and Ethan's stomach clenched. Then she shook her head. No. This place was never home. Just somewhere I existed between working. I'm ready to go. They caravanned back to Mill Creek, Julia driving the U-Haul while Ethan followed in his truck. Marcus met them at Ethan's apartment with pizza and beer, and the three of them spent New Year's Eve carrying boxes and rearranging furniture to accommodate 2 lives merging into one space. It wasn't seamless. Julia had twice as much stuff as Ethan, opinions about organization that clashed with his minimalist approach and a tendency to spread work files across every surface. But watching her hang her law degree on the wall next to his carpentry certification, seeing her books fill the empty shelves, finding her coffee mug next to his in the cabinet, all of it felt right in a way Ethan hadn't anticipated. They rang in the new year on his balcony, bundled in blankets against the January cold, watching fireworks from the town square 3 blocks away. This is it. Julia's voice was soft. New job Monday, new life, no safety net. No. Scared? Terrified. But the good kind. The kind that means I'm actually doing something instead of just thinking about it. Ethan pulled her closer, and Julia fit against him like she'd always belonged there. We're going to be terrible at this, living together. You'll get annoyed by my mess. I'll get frustrated when you work late. We'll fight about stupid things like whose turn it is to buy groceries. Probably. But maybe being terrible at it together is better than being good at being alone. They kissed as the fireworks reached their crescendo, and Ethan thought about the journey from that rainy October night to this moment. All the fear he'd had to face the walls, he'd had to dismantle the courage it took to stay instead of running. Julia started at Hayes Manufacturing on January 2nd. She came home that first day with stories about contract reviews and compliance issues and the novelty of leaving work at 6 instead of 9. Her eyes were brighter than Ethan had seen them in months. By mid-January, they'd found their rhythm. Julia worked her 45-hour weeks, coming home with energy to actually have conversations instead of just collapsing from exhaustion. Ethan split his time between the storefront and contract work, the Civic Center project, keeping him busy through winter. They had dinner together most nights, fell asleep, tangled together instead of separated by 3 hours of highway, woke up to the simple intimacy of shared morning coffee. It wasn't perfect. Julia brought work home more than she'd intended, reverting to old patterns when stress hit. Ethan struggled with having someone in his space constantly, occasionally needing to retreat to his workshop just for breathing room. They bickered about whose turn it was to clean, about Julia's tendency to leave cabinet doors open, about Ethan's habit of tracking sawdust through the apartment. But they also laughed more than Ethan had laughed in years, fell into bed exhausted but happy, built something real out of the fragile possibility they'd started with. February brought Daniel Chen back to Mill Creek. He stopped by Cole Woodworks on a Tuesday afternoon, extending his hand with the easy confidence of someone used to making good first impressions. Ethan Cole, Daniel Chen. My mom's been singing your praises for months. I'm renovating the Riverside building downtown and need someone who understands historical restoration work. They talked about the project, a 1920s structure being converted to mixed-use commercial space. Daniel needed custom woodwork for the lobby railings, built-in seating. $15,000 worth of detailed craftsmanship that would be highly visible to everyone in town. I'll send over the architectural drawings. We should set up a site meeting, maybe bring in your partner if she wants to review the contract terms. Ethan blinked. My partner. Julia Wells. My mom mentioned you two are together. She's corporate counsel now, right? Might be helpful to have her eyes on the agreement. It was so casually professional that Ethan almost missed the implication. But there it was. Daniel had known about Julia before approaching. Ethan had factored her into his decision-making. Was this genuine business or something else? He mentioned it to Julia that night, trying to sound casual and failing. Daniel Chen came by the shop, wants me for his Riverside building renovation. $15,000 project. Julia looked up from the contract she was reviewing. That's great. Daniel's supposed to be brilliant. Getting his business would be huge for your visibility. He mentioned you. Suggested you might want to review the contract. Something shifted in Julia's expression, a calculation Ethan recognized from when she was working through complicated legal questions. Smart. I probably should look at it anyway. Make sure the terms protect you. That's all. This is professional courtesy. Julia set down her papers, giving him her full attention. What are you actually asking? Ethan felt ridiculous even voicing the thought, but they'd promised honesty. He's successful, age-appropriate, shares your professional world in ways I don't, and he specifically mentioned working with both of us. So you think he's interested in me? I think he might be, and I think I'm being paranoid about it. Julia crossed the room and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Listen to me. I didn't leave a six-figure job in Philadelphia to come back to Mill Creek for Daniel Chen. I came back for you. Because you see me when I forget to see myself. Because you challenged me to want more instead of settling for safety. You're allowed to feel insecure sometimes. God knows I do, but don't let that fear poison something good. The speech was quintessentially Julia, direct, uncompromising, exactly what Ethan needed to hear, even if it made him uncomfortable. Okay, you're right. I'm being stupid. You're being human, but I need you to trust that I chose this, chose us, even when there are other options. Ethan kissed her, pouring gratitude and apology and love into the contact. When they broke apart, Julia smiled. Now show me those architectural drawings. Let's make sure Daniel's not trying to screw you over on contract terms. The Riverside project became a collaboration. Daniel's architectural vision, Ethan's craftsmanship, Julia's legal expertise, ensuring the agreements protected everyone's interests. They met at the building site on a cold Saturday in March, Daniel walking them through his plans while Ethan took measurements and notes. The lobby needs to feel historically authentic but functional. No shortcuts, no composite materials pretending to be wood. The real thing done right. And it was exactly Ethan's philosophy. They shook on the deal, and Daniel mentioned he'd be referring other architects and developers to Cole Woodworks. The kind of endorsement that could transform a small business into something sustainable. Walking back to the truck, Julia slipped her hand into Ethan's. You were professional. I'm proud of you. For not acting like a jealous idiot. For taking the opportunity instead of letting fear make the decision for you. By April, the Civic Center project was complete, under budget, ahead of schedule, with enough public praise that the mayor personally thanked Ethan at the ribbon cutting. The Riverside renovation was underway. Daniel stopping by the workshop weekly to check progress and occasionally bringing coffee for both Ethan and Julia. Whatever initial tension Ethan had felt dissolved into genuine professional respect. The storefront was profitable. Not wildly so, but enough that Ethan could afford to be selective about contract work, focus on custom pieces that challenged his skills instead of just paying bills. He'd hired a part-time assistant, a kid fresh out of Votech who wanted to learn traditional woodworking, and started teaching Saturday workshops for teenagers interested in the craft. Julia's work at Hayes Manufacturing proved exactly what she'd needed. Interesting enough to engage her mind, structured enough to respect her time, local enough that she could build connections in the community instead of just serving faceless corporations. She'd gained weight, she'd lost from stress, laughed more readily, stopped checking her phone compulsively for work emergencies. They still fought sometimes about money when Julia wanted to help with shop expenses, and Ethan's pride made him resistant about future plans when Julia brought up marriage, and Ethan deflected about whose family they'd spend holidays with. But the fights were surface tension over deeper currents of commitment and care. One Sunday in late April, they found themselves back on the Wells house porch where everything had started. Marcus was hosting his annual spring barbecue, and the yard was full of familiar faces. Mrs. Chen with Daniel, who'd brought his girlfriend from Philadelphia. The Rodriguezes with their grandkids. Tom Carter and his wife. The fabric of Mill Creek social life that Ethan had spent years keeping at arm's length. Julia leaned against the railing, watching the gathering with contentment. Happy. The question was simple, but Ethan took his time answering. Was he happy? He had a business he was proud of, a relationship that felt real, a community that had welcomed him back into its fold, a future that looked less like just surviving and more like actually thriving. Yeah, I'm happy. No regrets about us, about me coming back, about any of it. Not a single one. Ethan pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. I miss the money sometimes, and the prestige. There's a part of me that wonders if I threw away something valuable. Julia paused. But then I come home at 6 instead of midnight. I have dinner with you instead of takeout alone at my desk. I sleep through the night instead of waking up with work anxiety, and I know I made the right choice. They stood there watching their friends and family, and Ethan thought about the journey from that October rain to this April sunshine. How he'd stood in this exact spot, planning his escape, measuring the distance to his truck, calculating how quickly he could disappear. How Julia had stopped him with nothing but honesty and courage. I used to think bravery meant running toward danger, confronting fear head-on. Ethan's voice was quiet enough that only Julia could hear. But I've learned bravery is sometimes just standing still, saying, I'm here when everything in you wants to run, trusting that good things can last, choosing to stay every single day. Julia turned in his arms, her eyes bright with understanding. No more running. No more running. I'm home. She kissed him, and Marcus's voice carried from the yard. Get a room, you two. Some of us are trying to eat. But he was grinning when he said it, and Ethan flipped him off without breaking the kiss. Because this was home, not the town or the house or even the business he'd built. Home was Julia's hand in his, Marcus's easy acceptance, the community that had been waiting for him to stop pushing it away. Home was the choice to stay instead of leave, to build instead of protect, to trust that he deserved good things instead of just survival. They went back inside together, hand in hand, and Ethan felt the rightness of it settle into his bones. He'd spent 7 years running from the possibility of this real connection, honest vulnerability, the terrifying beauty of being seen and choosing to stay visible anyway. But standing here in the warm chaos of family and friends, Julia laughing at something Marcus said while Diane distributed plates of food, Ethan understood what he'd been running from had never been the threat he'd imagined. The real danger wasn't in staying. It was in spending a lifetime protecting yourself from joy because you were too afraid it wouldn't last. Some exits weren't worth maintaining. Some risks were worth every ounce of courage they required. And sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stop leaving and start believing you deserved to be happy. Julia caught his eye across the room and smiled, that private smile she saved just for him. And Ethan smiled back, finally home.